When you think of the Wraith in Dead by Daylight's current form, chances are you don't have any strong opinions on him. Sure, maybe he's better than Myers, Legion, etc., but he's nothing crazy. His increased map pressure when invisible is far from useless, and his post-uncloak boost can, on occasion, serve as a makeshift mind game or anti-loop tool. But if you're playing against him, you're probably not going to finish the game frustrated or tilted. What if I told you that this wasn't always the case? Back in my day, the Wraith wasn't just decent, he was absolutely terrible, and there were even people debating if he was the worst killer in the game back then. In some ways, Wraith is the yin to the pig's yang. While the pig received countless nerfs over the years, Wraith regularly found himself on the receiving end of buff after buff, spanning his long history in the game. To follow the Wraith's journey from the bottom of the tier list to where he's at now, we must first go all the way back to the Wraith's release. Back when the Wraith was released, just about everything in Dead by Daylight was different. The game had a lot more emphasis on stealth, people were still getting to grips with looping, and the killer tier list was way different. For starters, Trapper was the best killer in the game before Wraith was added, because the Wraith was the second ever killer in Dead by Daylight. As such, back then different things were valued more than they are nowadays. For instance, the ability to find survivors. While the Wraith's perks nowadays are laughed at, back then they definitely had some appeal to them because survivors would actually hide back then, so Bloodhound and Predator were more valuable than they are nowadays. Even progressing into more modern iterations of Dead by Daylight like 2018 to 2019, Predator and Bloodhound would make returns to the killer meta 3 or 4 times a year, not due to killers actually wanting the perks, but due to recurring bugs with survivor footstep audio, scratch marks, grunts of pain, and blood. Every few patches, one of the following would happen. Either survivors would stop making injured sounds altogether, the sound of survivor footsteps would stop playing, or scratch marks would simply cease at random intervals, or pools of blood from injured survivors would never spawn at all. Of course, these bugs would be fixed after a while, but once again return a few months later. Sometimes there were 2 or 3 of these bugs active at the same time, so sometimes killers ended up resorting to Bloodhound or Predator depending on which mechanic was bugged in an attempt to alleviate the problem. Killers would try to ignore the issues as there were always more valuable perks than Bloodhound or Predator, but sometimes they just had to rely on them when they couldn't rely on the buggy core mechanics. Speaking of the Wraith's perks, Shadowborn was much better and much worse at the same time back then. Back then, Shadowborn would increase the killer's field of view just like it does nowadays, but it would also make the game much brighter for killers, making it easier to spot survivors, and honestly, it just made the game feel so much better to play. But it also had the downsides of allowing the killer to be blinded faster and stay blinded for longer. Considering flashlights used to be able to insta-blind killers back then, the downsides were definitely overkill. Due to these hefty downsides, Shadowborn never saw the use it should have seen back then, and while nowadays it doesn't have those downsides anymore, it no longer makes the game brighter, so you might as well just use Monitor and Abuse if you want a higher field of view, since at least it gives you a smaller heartbeat too. So upon release, the Wraith's power was much different to how it was today. Some of these differences were no post-uncloak speed boost, significantly less movement speed while cloaked, slowed more while transitioning into the cloaked state, slowed more while transitioning out of the cloaked state, couldn't break pallets or kick gens etc. while cloaked, his bell and whooshing sounds could be heard map wide, he was stunned for longer when lightborned, blood didn't glow when he was cloaked, and he even set off crows when he was invisible. For the first year or so, the Wraith consistently received a constant flow of quality of life changes, which were really just tiny buffs, so small that you could barely justify calling them buffs, such as making it so he doesn't set off crows while invisible, starting the match pre-cloaked, lowering the volume of his footsteps while cloaked, and lowering the volume of his growling while cloaked many times. The Wraith's first proper set of changes were on the 14th of December 2017, with changes primarily aimed at reducing the amount of information he would give to survivors and making his cloaked mode slightly more useful. To reduce the information given to survivors, the Wraith's bell sound when cloaking and uncloaking was changed from being map wide to having a maximum range of 24 meters. Surprisingly, this was actually fairly big, as back then when playing Survivor you could be on a gen or heal someone or breaking a totem or whatever you're doing, and you'd hear each time he cloaked and uncloaked, effectively giving you a constant stream of updates on when he was in a chase or when he was scouting. To clarify, by map-wide bell sounds, I don't mean map-wide max volume non-location based like his current Bone Clapper add-on, I mean you could pinpoint his exact location just from the audio alone, distance and position included. Alongside this, the whooshing sound that plays after he has finished transforming into the invisible state was reduced from being map-wide to having a range of 40 meters. Due to this, you could still tell when he was going invisible from a hefty distance away, but at least it was better than hearing both cloaking and uncloaking. It's effectively half of the information being given. For the other half, making his cloaked mode more useful, they made it so he was slowed slightly less while bing-bonging to cloak and uncloak, as well as making it so the bell sound plays halfway through uncloaking instead of right at the start. Once again, it's an attempt to try and give survivors less information. I remember back then Wraith players were over the moon about the movement speed penalty while bing-bonging being reduced, even though it wasn't even a huge difference. And finally, two big changes for the main course for this patch. The Wraith now had Bloodhound built into his base kit, meaning he could see blood glowing extremely bright whilst invisible, honing in further to the hunter/scout role that the Wraith was supposed to have back then, alongside being able to kick gens and break pallets while invisible. Believe it or not, up until then Wraith players would have to cloak to scout the map, uncloak to kick a gen, cloak again to catch up to the survivor that just ran away from the gen, and then uncloak again to actually hit them. Ridiculous by today's standards, but back then that's all Wraith players knew. No longer was that the case though. He would now be able to interact just like when he was uncloaked, and he would simply fully uncloak and fully recloak automatically during the kicking animation. While the base kit Bloodhound didn't make much of a difference to higher tier players as tracking really wasn't that hard, the ability to interact with gens and pallets while cloaked was greatly appreciated. Technically it might not have even been that big of a difference, but it made the Wraith feel so much nicer to play. Just to recap, we're only at December of 2017 and the Wraith had already racked up 13 buffs, including the ones previously listed, with a lot of these buffs simply being the reduction of his growling volume over and over and over again. Despite this, the Wraith was still not clawing his way out of the low tier category. Players as a whole were getting better at the game, pallet loops were becoming more and more prominent, decisive strike was still an instant stun regardless of whether or not the survivor was hooked, and the nurse and hillbilly were added into the game, outshining the Wraith by absolute miles. Even with the buffs, Nurse and Billy had better map pressure and better killing potential than the Wraith, and Trapper had better anti-loop potential with his traps. Meanwhile, all the Wraith could do was go invisible and move ever so slightly faster, only to lose any distance gained in chase due to being slowed while uncloaking. So comparatively speaking, he barely even had an ability. Up until patch 2.1.0 on the 24th of July 2018, the Wraith continued to receive consistent, small buffs to his power, including making it so smoke appeared slightly later in his uncloak animation to avoid giving his position away early, and reducing his light burn stun duration from 4 seconds to 3 seconds. In case you don't know, light burn is a mechanic for the Nurse and Wraith where if you blind them with a flashlight while they're using their abilities, they get stunned. This even works on the Nurse nowadays while she's charging her blink. At this point, the Wraith had received a whopping 16 buffs, most of which were negligible volume changes, and he still remained in the dirt. Things needed to change. So 2 months later, on the 18th of September 2018, patch 2.2.0 hit, and behavior decided to stop being coy and actually commit to giving Wraith a real, tangible buff by nerfing the pick. They buffed 3 core aspects of the Wraith's ability. They reduced the movement speed penalty while uncloaking, completely removed the movement speed reduction while cloaking, and allowed him to attack instantly after uncloaking. And on top of this, they took his best add-ons and made them base kit. I'm talking about Windstorm. The Windstorm add-ons were the Wraith's most popular add-ons by an absolute landslide, and what they did was grant the Wraith a short burst of speed when coming out of invisibility, something I'm sure you're all familiar with, as it remains a core part of his base kit to this very day. The base kit Windstorm change was of course the talk of the town this patch, because it was so valuable to the Wraith, not only regaining the distance lost due to his uncloaked movement speed penalty, but also the burst of speed could be used to mind game certain loops, as it would force survivors to react very quickly. A side effect of the other changes was that he could now bait dead hard much better by starting the bell animation for only a fraction of a second, which starts an animation similar to him swinging, and it would no longer slow his movement speed to perform this bait. but they weren't done there. Alongside all of these core ability changes, they gave the Wraith a full add-on pass, buffing many and totally reworking others, including his old best add-ons, Windstorm. Since their old function was now base kit, they changed them to significantly increase his movement speed while invisible. However, the community's clear favourites after this add-on pass were Bone Clapper and Coxcombed Clapper. Bone Clapper made his bell map wide and disabled location-based bell audio, so survivors couldn't tell where he is, whereas Coxcombed Clapper would completely disable the bell audio altogether. The Wraith had finally climbed out of the low tier range, no longer a joke of a character, and now has a great set of add-ons that shifted his strengths into various directions. He felt great to play and was able to keep up with most of the killer roster. For the next few years, the Wraith would continue to receive tiny, negligible buffs and audio volume changes, albeit less frequently than he did before. This trend would continue up until the 9th of February 2021, when patch 4.5.0 released, releasing the next set of proper buffs and marking the end of the constant flow of tiny buffs for the Wraith. In this set of proper buffs, the Wraith would find himself finally becoming properly invisible instead of shimmering from a range of 20 meters or further. Any survivors closer than 20 meters would still see him shimmering as usual. This change makes total sense because it was kind of awkward before having a killer where their ability was to go invisible, but they didn't really go invisible because survivors could still see a shimmering effect. It was awkward. So at least he would now have an aspect of genuine invisibility in his kit. Additionally, the post-uncloak windstorm speed boost effect would be increased by 25%, from 1 second to 1.25 seconds. This granted him even more lethality and mind game potential in certain loops, alongside changing his animations when kicking gens and pallets while invisible, making it so he only partially uncloaks during the animation instead of fully uncloaking, like he did up until then. At this point in time, the Wraith was in a weird position. Some people in the community were adamant that the Wraith was top tier now, while the majority agreed that he was definitely decent, but not that good. One thing was certain, Wraith was seeing incredible amounts of play, somewhat comparable to the amount of blights that you'd see nowadays, and people were starting to get annoyed. Maybe that quarter of a second speed boost increase really did make him too good, or maybe playing against the same killer all day long every day is just annoying regardless of how strong they are. No matter what the answer really is, a month later the Wraith got a power shift, a buff and a nerf at the same time. The buff being faster base movement speed while invisible, and the nerf was that his movement speed reduction while uncloaking was intensified. This patch once again found the Wraith climbing up tier lists just a little bit due to the increased map pressure and mobility granted by the increased movement speed while invisible. Combined with the new reworked windstorm add-ons, you could increase the Wraith's map pressure to insane levels, even reaching levels similar to the Hillbilly. Pair that with the reworked ruin, which was still a good perk back then, and the Wraith found himself in the strongest position he had ever been, turning that map pressure into gen pressure, giving him more time to get out pallets, and then eventually turn that into chase pressure as the survivors began to run out of pallets. Half a year later, the Wraith would receive a nerf, reducing the post-uncloak speed boost from 1.25 seconds back down to the previous value of 1 second, which is the current iteration of Wraith as of the time of recording this video. Even now, with the death of Ruin, the Wraith still finds himself in a good position. His map pressure lends itself nicely to today's current killer meta of gen kicking, with perks like Call of Brine, Overcharge and Eruption greatly benefiting high mobility killers who can apply these perks to lots of gens in quick succession over and over again. All of this is further amplified with the Windstorm add-ons, which I think are still heavily slept on to this day, with most players still going straight to either of the clappers and faster uncloak speed due to the initial splash they made upon the add-on rework. I honestly think a lot of people haven't even tried the new Windstorm purely because all the hype was focused on the clappers. Even if double Windstorm isn't the way to go, I think it's at least worth pairing one Windstorm add-on with your clappers. You'd be surprised at how much of a difference they make to your map pressure. So sure, the Wraith isn't up there with the Nurse and Blight, but there is no denying that he is leagues above where he used to be. I hope you enjoyed the video and thank you so much for sticking to the end. If you have any other things you'd like me to discuss in a similar style to this video, be sure to let me know. You can catch me live on twitch.tv/Ardetha.